What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and you read that title correctly. All the superheroes die. So this is a story called Days of Future Past Doomsday, and this is designed to kind of explain exactly how events transpired that led to the original Days of Future Past storyline. For those of you guys who don't know about Days of Future Past, it was written in Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142 by Chris Claremont. And basically the Sentinels took over North America and eradicated pretty much all the superheroes in existence. Those who didn't die were just basically sent off to internment camps awaiting their executions. So what ends up happening here is this basically picks up in what you and I could refer to as like year zero, which is effectively the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly. Now, there is a differentiation between how this story unfolds and the original Days of Future Past, which leads me to believe this is in an alternate reality. And the reason why I say that is that in the original Days of Future Past, it was Mystique and her Brotherhood of Evil Mutants that killed Senator Robert Kelly, Professor Xavier, and Moira McTaggart in order to establish that mutants should not be messed with. And that's when everything went sideways. Here, it's just Robert Kelly. And in fact, Charles Xavier will show up over the course of this story. But within 4 years of Robert Kelly's assassination, William Stryker is sworn in as President of the United States. Now, this is a horrific circumstance. And the reason why is because William Stryker is a religious fundamentalist. This guy leads a group called the Purifiers. Their whole charter is that they believe it's their mission from God to destroy the mutant population. Now, William Stryker can't simply just rebrand the United States Army as like the Purifiers and then just start taking out mutants everywhere they go. There is the game of politics. And so in the 5th year, the United States Congress passes the Mutant Control Act. This is exactly what it sounds like. It is a bill passed by Congress to basically restrict the rights of the mutant population. Now, Matt Murdock, Daredevil, ends up approaching the Supreme Court and makes an argument and essentially saying that because the mutant population are still citizens of the United States and are at their very core human, it's restricting the rights of US citizens, i.e. it violates the US Constitution. The United States Supreme Court agrees with him and they overturn the Mutant Control Act. Now, in the original Days of Future Past, we didn't know that it was Matt Murdock who had done this. We just simply knew that the Supreme Court overturned the Mutant Control Act. The other part is that in the original Days of Future Past, there was no reason to believe William Stryker was president, largely because his character had not been created in Marvel Comics by that point in time. But it does make sense, right? Like the original depiction of the president and then William Stryker, they look very similar. And so by year 6, the United States government does exactly what it did in the original Days of Future Past story. It launches the Sentinel program. Now, something to understand about this whole Sentinel program and the history behind it is super fascinating. You had a guy by the name of Bolivar Trask. Bolivar Trask was the one who originally created the Sentinels, but these are not necessarily Bolivar Trask Sentinels. They are, but they're not. The Sentinels that you're familiar with from like X-Men the Animated Series and so on and so forth, that's Stephen Lang, not to be confused with Scott Lang. The two of them are not related. But basically, after Bolivar Trask was originally defeated in the X-Men comics, the Sentinel program was handed over to Stephen Lang, who basically redesigned them, updated them with newer technology, and sent them out into the world. Such as it is, it doesn't look like Stephen Lang has any involvement here. So effectively, they're using the Stephen Lang design, but Bolivar Trask and the Trask dynasty are essentially the ones behind it. But by year 11, the Sentinels are sent out into the world, or really into the United States itself. But instead of just immediately attacking everything, what they end up doing is just kind of walking around. The idea is that they're there, quote unquote, for safety, right? To be a kind of non-human police force. What the Sentinels are actually doing is scanning and cataloging mutants, studying their powers, learning what they're capable of. And so by year 18, we end up in Stamford, Connecticut. Now, for those of you guys who are familiar with Stamford, Connecticut, you pretty much already know what's about to go down here. For those of you guys who aren't, Stamford, Connecticut was the catalyst for the Civil War event in Marvel Comics. Basically, things transpire almost the exact same way, but it doesn't lead to civil war. Instead, what ended up happening here is that because of the passage of the Mutant Control Act, the Avengers resigned in solidarity with the mutant population. Exactly how that is in solidarity of mutants, I don't necessarily know, because I don't see the Avengers fighting alongside them, right? So what you end up getting by the federal government is basically the creation of the Defenders. Now, this is not the first time in Marvel Comics that the federal government has created a federally sanctioned superhero team. And in fact, if my memory serves me, the original X Factor from Bob Layton and then eventually Walter and Louise Simonson, yes, that team was composed of like the original X-Men just on a team of their own. When Marvel relaunched everything in the 1990s and you got Uncanny X-Men and then X-Men Volume 2, X Factor ended up getting a new roster with like Strong Guy and people like that, but they were a government sanctioned superhero team. So it's not that uncommon to see. And you even saw it more recently in the events of like Dark Reign, right? And so on and so forth. But the kicker here is that while these guys look like Avengers, they're not. A really good example of this is that instead of Steve Rogers as Captain America, it's John Walker, i.e. US agent. Instead of Iron Man, you basically have Obadiah Stane operating as the Ironmonger, making himself look like Iron Man. But the thing about this is that as far as the X-Men are concerned, it's just them fighting a villainous group out in Stamford. But then Wolverine picks up on a scent and he realizes something's wrong here, right? Like there's something going on. Specifically, he figures out that when it comes to Nitro, his scent's all wrong, right? That he's got some kind of chemical or drug in his system. And that's when we realize it's basically just like it was at the beginning of Civil War, that Nitro has taken mutant growth hormone, basically a drug that amplifies the powers of mutants. And because Nitro's ability is to self-detonate and let off a massive explosion without destroying himself, it's exactly what happens here. He blows up the entirety of Stamford, Connecticut. Boom. President of the United States declares martial law. Now, here's where I kind of disagree with exactly what's going on here, right? We do get Valerie Cooper, who's the Office of National Emergency Liaison for Mutant Affairs. For those of you guys who don't know about Valerie Cooper, this girl was like hardcore, man. Like the Commission on Superhuman Activities. If you guys remember like the old Chris Claremont stuff from back in the 70s and 80s, that was all Valerie Cooper. In effect, she was kind of like the liaison to the superhero community, and she was the one that would keep them on a tight leash as far as the federal government was concerned. Because back at the time when Days of Future Past was originally written, the general consensus when it came to like the entirety of the superhero community, and you saw it in like the Fantastic Four, the X-Men, Captain America comics, so on and so forth, is that the federal government was very much cracking down on superheroes being able to have this kind of like free reign out in the world and all the kind of stuff that came with it. Where I disagree with what's happening is we've got Henry Peter Gyrick and Wilson Fisk along with Simon Trask. When it came to the original Days of Future Past event, there was no internal human circle. And in fact, the Sentinels had basically just become self-aware. What I do like is that it looks like they're kind of starting with this, but they're not going to end with this. Because what Simon Trask does is he speaks up and he says, okay, we may have an unintended consequence here. And when the question is asked, what's the unintended consequence? He says the Sentinel's primary directive is to maintain order and protect the populace. I'm concerned they might determine that the most efficient means to do so is to simply just take over. And when the question is asked, what does this have to do with Stamford, Connecticut? The response of Simon is, martial law means the suspension of civil rights. Taking control of America is certainly easier once democracy is on a timeout. After all, isn't that why the four of us orchestrated Stamford? And so where Wilson Fisk speaks up and he says, you're saying that you think at some point the Sentinels will decide we're working for them instead of the other way around. The response of Trask is, I think they may already have done that. Now, here's the reason why that's so important. In the Days of Future Past comic, when the Sentinels took over, while we weren't explicitly told exactly what their line of logic was, it was pretty simple. And in fact, X-Men the Animated Series explained it perfectly, that when the Sentinels were tasked with basically seeing mutants as the enemy, it was a logical choice for humanity, an illogical choice for the Sentinels, because Sentinels are just robots. They just follow orders, right? They really don't understand nuance. With humanity, we routinely look for reasons to justify our belief systems, even if our justifications are nonsensical, right? We can just make up any reason we want to and then go forward believing that. For a robot, it makes no logical sense. And so the Sentinels would look at the mutant population, they would look at the human population, and they would say, by all standards of measurement, mutants are humans. Therefore, if our task is to control the mutant population, that means control the human population. And that's why in the original Days of Future Past storyline, the Sentinels took over everything. And in fact, a perfect example of the nonsensical logic of humanity comes in the form of Simon Trask debating Steve Rogers on national television. And what ends up happening is Steve Rogers presents basically the logical argument, right? The one that you or I or anybody would expect to see, which is to say, what's the difference between like the Avengers or the X-Men or the Fantastic Four, right? Like the Avengers and Fantastic Four routinely save the world and we're championed as heroes. The X-Men do the same thing, and you basically see them as like criminals, people that need to be contained and controlled. But the response of Simon Trask is, we're talking about two distinctly different things. Number one, the Avengers all gained their powers through some kind of external means. You, Steve Rogers, got your powers by way of the super soldier serum. That the Incredible Hulk was a result of gamma radiation, Thor is a godly being, so on and so forth. With mutants, their powers developed during puberty. So are we really supposed to just kind of stand idly by as a 13-year-old who has no real understanding of the full totality of their actions and the impact that they have, who has the ability to simply just wipe out an entire school system with some kind of an explosion, or shoot lasers out of his eyes, or read the minds of other people? Do we just kind of let that kid exist? Like, who knows what might happen in that circumstance? Are you really going to tell me that we don't have the right to be afraid, right? That regulating these human weapons isn't the safe and necessary thing to do. This is not prejudice, Captain, it's common sense. And that's really where the crux of the entire argument came from, that if mutants are people who develop their powers at such a time in their life to where they can't truly understand the consequences of their actions, should they be allowed to just roam free out there in the world? Or should they be regulated and controlled the same way that we control guns and different things along those lines? That's where the arguments get interesting, because then as people, we would just kind of arbitrarily say, but like they're human though, so we can't do that because there's just an arbitrary difference that we've created between a dangerous human and like a dangerous weapon, right? You know, so it's really interesting how this whole thing unfolds, but where the heroes really start to die really comes by way of Spider-Man. And the reason why is because what we're told is that as time progressed, humanity stopped differentiating between heroes and mutants. And what initially started out as anti-mutant fervor became anti-hero fervor. They started going after everybody. And so where there's like this great big huge protest that erupts between mutants and humans, Spider-Man steps in, he tries to quell everything, and they beat him to death. They literally kill Spider-Man. Now, one of the things that's kind of discussed there is that Peter Parker could have stood up to them and he could have fought his way out, but the concern is that he didn't really want to hurt anybody. I gotta tell you, man, if I'm Peter Parker and I'm being attacked by a mob of people, everybody's gonna get one, right? Everybody's getting attacked. I'm making it out of there. Just be glad I don't kill you in the process, right? But then following that, you pick up with Professor Charles Xavier. And this is where things get interesting, because what's been going on in the midst of all of this is Magneto is making his move. And where this does kind of seem to come out of left field, the logic of Magneto is actually incredibly sound here, because with the X-Men trying to find Magneto and Magneto going after like the world's nuclear arsenals, of course, S.H.I.E.L.D. steps in, S.H.I.E.L.D. aids the X-Men in helping to locate the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, but then the group goes directly after Magneto. And this is one of those instances where I guarantee you guys are going to look at this and you're going to be like, Magneto's 100% right. Because what ends up happening is where Xavier says, no, we can't do this, Magneto. You're playing into their hands. They want to see a violent mutant out there doing violent things to justify their belief systems. The response of Magneto to Charles Xavier is, you're talking as if they're using any kind of logic. They've made up their minds. The Mutant Control Act has been passed. Like, they're targeting us. There's no more like trying to stop this from happening. There's no more like reasoning with them and trying to get them to understand, right? He's like, they are counting on nothing except your pliant acquiescence. And he says, they pass laws to make criminals of us and you do nothing. They send out sentinels to march across our country and you do nothing. They use us as a pretext to declare martial law and you do nothing. Tell me, Charles, all these men and women, so many enemies who hate and fear us, and yet the only person you and your X-Men stand against is me. And so it's such a phenomenal argument here, because the response of the X-Men is like, we're coming after you because you're trying to take over the world. And Magneto's whole stance is to protect us from them, because this is no longer a debate, or this is no longer a discussion that can be had. It's open war, right? Are we fighting in the streets? No, not necessarily, but they've made their move. They're waging war against us. And he says, they'll come for us and for all of us. And we'll tell ourselves, as we always have, that it's okay. They'll brand us like cattle, and we'll tell ourselves that it's no different than a driver's license. They'll put us in ghettos, and we'll tell ourselves it's just for a little while. Then they'll put us in camps, and we'll tell ourselves it will end soon. We'll be right about that much at least. You think I'm speaking of the future? I am not. I'm telling you about the past. I know it can happen because I've watched it happen. Magneto is literally looking at a repeat of everything that happened during World War II in Germany. And he's not wrong, right? That in a lot of ways, even as the story's kind of being told in hindsight, Xavier is being seen as a guy who has this naive optimism, right? That in the face of an asteroid moments from crashing into the earth and annihilating all life across the planet, there's still hope that the day can be saved. We're well far past that point. There's nothing to be done here, right? The end is nigh. And so what we end up doing is jumping aboard basically a plane, which is a response to Magneto, which is to say the government's trying to move these different nuclear weapons to a more secure location because they realize Magneto's going after that. The problem is that Jason Wyngarde, Mastermind, a mutant that has the ability to manipulate the five senses, is basically aboard this plane. So when you have KATE PRYDE and Jean Grey and Cyclops who get here, this takes place after the events of Dark Phoenix. Why does that matter? Because Jason Wyngarde in that story had screwed with the mind of Jean Grey and led her to becoming the Dark Phoenix in the first place. And so as, I don't really know if I would call it payback, but kind of that victimization that she experienced, she attacks Jason Wyngarde. And in fact, she actually kills him. But in the process, she inadvertently activates the nuclear weapons with 15 seconds counting down. These bombs go off, no one's really able to keep it contained, but Cyclops is basically phased by KATE PRYDE, meaning she's able to make him intangible. And so while it doesn't really kill him, it does burn his eyes out of his head. So they actually have to remove his eyeballs at a future point in time, meaning he has no powers whatsoever. And so following this, what you end up doing is you pick up at basically the funeral of Jean Grey, right? That everybody's kind of there in attendance, but you effectively have Magneto who shows up, who wasn't necessarily welcomed. And in fact, while a fight breaks out initially between Wolverine and Magneto, and Wolverine pulls a plastic gun with polymer bullets that Magneto wouldn't be able to stop, Cyclops decides he wants to hear what Magneto has to say. And in effect, it's a ceasefire, right? It's a truce. That it is really Magneto and Xavier agreeing to kind of work together, but for the most part, to try things Xavier's way, and to see if there's a way to bring some kind of peaceful resolution to this entire conflict. Spoiler alert, there's not, right? So what ends up happening is we get this really, really cool monologue, right? Where we're told, despite everything, the professor never hated Magneto. It was worse than that. His heart broke for never being able to bring his friend to his side. Magneto was right, of course, about things getting worse. The first thing President Stryker did was get Congress to reinstate the Mutant Control Act. This time, the Supreme Court chose not to stop it. Under the Mutant Control Act, the government began placing mutants in relocation centers, quote unquote, for their own protection. Some mutants and their families fled north to Canada, but most stayed in America under the mistaken belief that things would eventually get better. And they didn't, right? Magneto's prophecy came to pass, because if humanity is really good at doing anything, it's just constantly repeating cycles of events that have happened in the past, especially if we never learn from them. And so what ends up happening is that by year 19, Henry Peter Gyrick shows up to Professor Charles Xavier, and he essentially tells him, we've got warrants for every single one of your X-Men and you to be taken to a relocation center. So you can either come willingly or you can come forcefully. But Xavier calls his bluff, because what he realizes is that there are the optics of what would happen if the human population just attacked the entirety of the X-Men mansion. Even all of the angry and anti-mutant fervor that's out there, people wouldn't necessarily side with like an unprovoked attack against innocent people, especially if the X-Men just did nothing and allowed themselves to be killed on national television. They wouldn't really be martyrs per se, although they kind of would, because what that could potentially do is turn popular sentiment or public sentiment against the federal government. Then you have 300 million people who have all waged war against you. And so in response to that, what Henry Peter Gyrick and Valerie Cooper do is they bring in General Thunderbolt Ross, right? The guy who traditionally goes after the Incredible Hulk. And they task him with launching an attack against the X-Men, right? And then in turn, trying to spin it in order to make it look like the X-Men attacked first. General Thunderbolt Ross chooses not to, because despite how he may be portrayed in the X-Men comics, he is a man of honor, right? He wouldn't really go after the X-Men unprovoked or attack people unprovoked. More so than that, right? The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, the United States Army or the United States military cannot enforce laws within the borders of the United States. So ultimately, General Thunderbolt Ross is relieved of command, somebody else is put in his place, and the attack goes down. The main X-Men roster are basically led to a conflict out in Muir Island, so the entirety of the X-Men mansion is basically laid empty. In response to that, while that happens, William Stryker and his forces attack the X-Men mansion. Professor Xavier is there to witness all the death and destruction. Iceman is one of the first to fall, right? He's just grabbed by a Sentinel and he's one part melted, one part destroyed, right? But literally just shattered, and that's the end of him. Xavier tries to use his telepathy to take over the minds of the various soldiers who were standing out there and are intending to invade the entire mansion. But Frank Simpson, also known as Nuke, who's historically been part of Weapons Plus, this guy fires off a shot and kills Xavier on the spot. Following that, you have guys like Nightcrawler who were destroyed by Sentinels. It's just like Michael Corleone at the end of Godfather, right? Like executing the heads of the 5 families. It's a multi-pronged strike against everybody except for the core X-Men. So the only real X-Men that you have left here are like Storm, Colossus, Forge, Kitty Pryde, right? Like Wolverine. That's more or less it, but the leadership is essentially gone. And so what ends up happening is that in this moment of realizing that things are going to go belly up, that things are in the darkest of times, there's a kind of connection that's been forming for quite some time between Kitty Pryde and Colossus, and the two of them get married. But one of the funny things is that we're told it would be like the last happy day that anybody would really experience for any measure of time. Because following that, for the X-Men, it's just basically guerrilla warfare tactics. They're jumping from one location to the next. By year 20, they're in Madripoor, and they're just moving from one safe location, constantly underground. They never really can operate out of a singular base of operations. More so than that, the Sentinels have evolved to a point where now they're sending out Nimrods. Why does that matter? Because the Nimrod Sentinel model was a version of the Sentinel that not only could detect what a mutant's power was, but could also develop a countermeasure to it and figure out what psychological or emotional weaknesses they would have and use it against them, right? To fight against a Nimrod was to fight against a Sentinel that could attack you both physically, mentally, and emotionally. It was one of the most devastating Sentinels to ever exist out there. Imagine fighting 3. More so than that, in the initial attack against the X-Men mansion, Rachel Summers, the daughter of Jean Grey and Cyclops in this universe, was one of the only people to survive. But she was taken by the US government, specifically Ahab, but she was taken and she was turned into a hound. What does that mean? A hound is a mutant that was used to hunt other mutants. And because she was such a powerful telepath, it made perfect sense she would be used for that purpose. One of the first people she attacks is Storm. Now, what's also crazy about this is Franklin Richards does exist in this universe, and he did exist in Days of Future Past. The difference is that Franklin Richards' reality warping abilities were nowhere near as advanced as they became during like Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four run when he was older. A lot of that was because when Franklin was younger, Reed Richards put mental blocks in his head to keep him from accessing the full totality of his powers. More or less, it looks like during Days of Future Past, those mental blocks were never removed. So he's just like a really capable telepath and telekinetic, but we don't know if he'll ever tap into his powers. In the original Days of Future Past story, he never did. He never accessed the full totality of his reality warping abilities. He did in Days of Future Present, but he never did in Days of Future Past. And so where Storm and Franklin Richards are both taken into custody by the US government and taken into an internment camp, Forge and Beast are 2 of the last X-Men remaining, and Beast agrees to stay there and to help Forge face off against the Sentinels Beast is eradicated in an instant. He's destroyed. The Sentinels in turn take Forge. And the only thing we're told is that the fate they have for him is a fate worse than death. And so following that, you switch over to year 22, right? We're told in the years that followed, the Sentinels only stepped up their aggression. Mutants were either branded with M badges, imprisoned in camps, or hunted by hounds. Non-mutant heroes tried to stand against the rising fascism, but not without cost. Because what ends up going on is the Fantastic Four arrive on the scene and basically encounter Rachel Summers. And because Rachel Summers has had history with Franklin, the two of them were like a romantic couple, they had a whole history together and everything, the Fantastic Four try to use that connection in order to try to bring her back to reality. She basically attacks Ben Grimm, she kills the Thing, she destroys Reed Richards, and then Susan Storm is killed by Ahab, right? Like the Fantastic Four wiped out in one fell swoop. Then you jump to year 26 and you pick up with Banshee, right? Sean Cassidy, this guy that has the ability to emit a scream, his power sucks and basically he dies, right? Because he's one of the crappiest mutants to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics. The guy can scream and fly. Rahoo. So when it comes to like this guy's death, this guy's destroyed. Rachel Summers jumps back onto the scene again and goes after Kitty Pryde. This time, Rachel is basically taken out by Bishop. Now, why Bishop's here, I have no clue. It's one of the weirdest things. And in fact, it flies in the face of everything we know about the original Days of Future Past story. Because what ends up happening is Bishop is the one that contacts Rachel Summers, or really contacts Kitty Pryde, and tells her that Rachel is the key to saving this entire timeline and preventing this timeline from ever coming into the future. And in fact, he says he's from an alternate future, right? Another timeline, which is similar to Days of Future Past. Honestly, it feels like Bishop's just thrown in here for the sake of throwing him in here. But what he does is he tells her exactly what's supposed to happen in order to save this timeline. Now, assuming that this concludes the way the original Days of Future Past did, which I don't even know how it is that it's going to conclude that way. Everything just kind of feels so different now. In essence, Rachel Summers would send the mind of Kitty Pryde into the past to warn the X-Men of what was going to happen. The X-Men would stop the assassination of Robert Kelly and it would save the day. But I have no clue if that's what's actually going to happen or not. And perhaps even there's no saving this timeline. What they do end up doing though, is they basically cure the brainwashing of Rachel Summers, right? Get her back to her normal self and then send her back in as an agent that's basically been missing for some time, but is finally returned. That the brainwashing process is effectively recommenced, this time with mental blocks that Rachel herself is able to keep in place, so she never fully succumbs to it. And in response to that, Rachel Summers does kill Ahab, but she's captured by the Sentinels. This explains how it is that in the original Days of Future Past story, Rachel Summers was in an internment camp. Because one of the things to know, all these characters that you see here, right, like Colossus, Kitty Pryde, Rachel Summers, Storm, Magneto, and so on, they all end up in a concentration camp, right, where mutants are basically being held. With Magneto, it's going to be a little bit interesting here in a second because I'm curious how you take it. But what we do is we switch over to year 28, and where you have Colossus and Kitty Pryde who are on the run trying to escape these Sentinels that are coming after them. The Sentinels wipe out their kids. Literally, the Sentinels take their kids out, just completely and totally incinerate them. Following that, Colossus initially wants to go after the Sentinels, but ultimately doesn't. Now, while we're not explicitly told here, what it looks like is the Sentinels have officially taken over, that humanity no longer has any involvement in any of this. The Sentinels have taken over everything. There doesn't really seem to be a clear delineation as to when that happened, but at the very least, that seems to be the case. And so by year 29, right, 29 years after all this has started, you pick up in the internment camp. And of course, you do have Franklin Richards and you've got Rachel Summers who more or less make amends and everything kind of gets sorted. But what you do at that point is you jump over to Wolverine, who's met by the arrival of Magneto. And the two of them have never really reconciled their differences after the death of Jean. And so this is like the first time they've met since the funeral and that initial conversation when Magneto walked away. But one of the things to know about the original Days of Future Past is that Wolverine was actually working with the North American resistance, meaning he and other mutants that were out there that hadn't been captured were operating inside Canada, which largely became a kind of safe haven for those mutants that didn't stay in North America. And he would occasionally travel to the United States, which would basically become a safe haven for those mutants that didn't stay in the United States. And that in turn, he would travel back back and forth between Canada and the States, either helping people escape the US or bringing information to those who needed it and taking pot shots against the Sentinels where he could, when he could. But what Magneto does here, in kind of a weird decision, I don't really know why Marvel did this, but they basically say that like the Sentinels have found a way to weaponize the planet itself by causing like environmental calamity, right? It kind of seems unnecessary, seems a little over the top, and seems like it's injected here for no real logical reason, but they're basically using Scarlet Witch to do it. So Magneto, leading a resistance force consisting of Wolverine and Jubilee, ends up going in, rescuing Wanda Maximoff. Wanda's taken by Wolverine out of the entire facility, but not before she destroys the machine, and kind of tells Magneto, keep on fighting. Whatever you do, just keep going. And so Magneto stays behind. He's attacked by the Sentinels that arrive on the scene, and he's impaled. Presumably, Magneto's dead, unlike the last Days of Future Past or the original Days of Future Past, where he was simply handicapped. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. The final issue comes out in 2 weeks. Let me know down in the comments whether or not you want me to cover it, and I will catch you all later. Peace.